entire history of North Korea. The entire Korean peninsula was under Japanese occupation after 1905. Japan's occupation was unquestioned by foreign powers, and it presented its occupation as a civilizing project. For the Koreans, the story was quite the opposite. Thousands of guerrilla fighters bitterly resisted Japan until 1910, when they were all but destroyed and Korea became fully part of the Japanese Empire. The story of Japanese-occupied Korea is one shared by many colonies. Industrialization and economic expansion came with discrimination against the native peoples, as wealth and resources were siphoned away to the imperial masters. The initial guerrilla resistance was over, but the resentment of the Koreans did not go away. Japan ran Korea like a military colony, with armed teachers in schools and a massive militarized police force overseeing all aspects of life. Also, like many colonies, they longed for independence. With the end of the First World War and all its promises of freedom, Korea agitated for its independence. Protests swept the nation in 1919, which the Japanese put down brutally. In one case, they locked hundreds of protesters inside a church and burned them alive. However, the tide couldn't be stemmed. The wave of Korean nationalism rose, and at its head were the communists. Communist movements were common across the world in the early 19th century. Galvanized by the success of Vladimir Lenin in the Russian Revolution, the communists promised wealth redistribution, an end to profit-seeking and imperialism, and a new prosperous beginning for its people. Time would put those promises to the test, but the dream of the communist utopia enchanted countless people, especially in Korea. Korean communists quickly became the tip of the anti-Japanese spear. Numerous guerrilla and civil groups emerged in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, trying to achieve an independent communist Korea. The Japanese responded with firing squads, prison time, and terror. This killed many guerrillas and forced others to flee, including a young man the world would come to know as Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912 near Pyongyang. His early life is drowned in later propaganda, but it seems he was raised by Christian parents who escaped into China when he was still a child after getting involved in anti-Japanese activity. In China, young Kim fell in love with communist ideas. China had its own active communist movements, which Kim joined as soon as he was able. In 1931, he became a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party and got involved with anti-Japanese protests and militant action. When Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in 1931, Kim joined the resistance, hoping to drive Japan out of China and eventually his homeland. Kim proved to be a successful guerrilla leader. He quickly worked his way up the ranks with successful strike after successful strike, operating in both China and Korea. In 1937, he led 200 guerrillas in the Battle of Pochanbo, just across the Korean border, where his forces defeated Japanese soldiers and burned down a police station and other occupied buildings. The victory put Kim Il-sung on the map and made him one of the most famous guerrilla leaders in East Asia. For later North Korean propaganda, it was the true start of Kim's path to power. Kim himself wrote about the battle, saying that, quote, "The flames over the night sky of Pochanbo in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness." Kim's success earned him the nickname of the Tiger. The Japanese military sent out units to hunt him down and may have killed his secret first wife, which forced Kim to retreat into the Soviet Union, where he was officially enrolled in the Red Army and spent most of the Second World War in hiding. When the USSR declared war on Japan in 1945, Soviet armies marched into the Korean peninsula. Kim followed shortly after. At the same time, US forces landed in the south. After evicting the Japanese occupiers, the Allied powers decided to split Korea, much as they had done Germany. American officials chose the 38th parallel, a previously meaningless line on a map as the boundary between the two occupied zones. This line, apparently chosen in half an hour by two random American colonels, would become one of the most important borders in the world for the next 80 years. Korea had no natural north-south division, and everyone wanted a united Korean peninsula, under their particular ideology, of course. The Soviets knew they would need a reliable Korean communist leader to achieve this, and Stalin personally chose the greatest of the Korean communist guerrillas for the job. In December 1945, Kim Il-sung became first secretary of the Communist Party of Korea, giving Kim power over his nation that he would hold for the next 50 years. Kim had risen from lowly guerrilla fighter to leader of his nation, or had he? A bizarre conspiracy theory claims that the Kim Il-sung who entered North Korea in 1945 was not the same one who led the Battle of Pocheonbo. According to this theory, after the real Kim Il-sung fled into the USSR, Stalin made him disappear like so many other communist figures who threatened his popularity. It sounds crazy, but a CIA investigation into the theory concluded that it was right. They believed that the Kim Il-sung in North Korea was a criminal who the Soviets blackmailed into assuming a false identity so they could manipulate him. A Soviet officer who worked with Kim also wrote privately that the later Kim was an imposter whose name was stolen from the famous guerrilla leader who had actually died years earlier. These days, historians think the theory is nonsense. Several people who knew Kim as a guerrilla confirmed that it was the same man. The CIA report had simply been wrong, which happens far more often than the CIA likes to admit. Still, it's not impossible that the entire Kim dynasty is built on a Soviet lie. Kim the guerrilla and Kim the first secretary were probably the same. But no such unity existed for Korea itself. Under two contrasting governments, the Korean peninsula became a flashpoint for the new Cold War between communism and capitalism. In the South, General John R. Hodge ran the U.S. Army's military government of Korea, while Kim acted as the figurehead for a Soviet-backed government in the North. Historians have often overstated the power of the Soviets in the North. Modern scholars accept that after 1946, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean Workers' Party were leading the way in setting North Korean policy. Kim began a series of communistic reforms in his nation. In March 1946, he began seizing land from landlords without compensation and redistributing it to the people, remaking the North's economy in a matter of months with thousands of new small peasant holdings. He set out a 2-year economic plan to guide production and investment, relying on new levels of state control over the economy and a focus on heavy industry. All industry, banks, communications, and transport infrastructure was nationalized. And in July 1946, Kim introduced a sexual equality law that guaranteed equal working rights for women. The reforms were successful, and North Korea saw an incredible economic recovery in the first few years after 1945. All was not easy within North Korea, though. Different factions of communists threatened Kim's control, and each tried to push North Korea in their own direction. Kim's Kapsun, or guerrilla faction, held power for now. As the name implies, they were mostly made up of former guerrilla fighters whose effectiveness had earned the faith of Stalin. But Stalin's faith was awfully fragile. This made the Soviet Korean communists a particular threat. Made up of ethnic Koreans with Soviet citizenship, they leaned heavily towards Moscow. While they hadn't proven their effectiveness enough to earn Stalin's favor, the heavy involvement of the Soviets made them a risky rival for the young Kim regime. Then there was the Yunnan faction. This was a Chinese-aligned communist wing, most of its members being part of the CCP. After Mao's communists took power in China in 1949, the Yunnan faction became a potent threat to Kim's Korea-centric approach that threatened to pull North Korea towards Beijing. Last, there were the South Korean communists. Many had fled the South when the American troops arrived and made it their main goal to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. They were less of an immediate threat until reunification was achieved, but their leader, Park Han-young, was the closest thing Kim had to a rival. Park and Kim had both been invited to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to judge which was the suitable leader. While Kim had won out, Park remained a force to be reckoned with. Unsurprisingly, Kim anchored himself in the military. He'd been a guerrilla fighter for decades and made it a huge part of his ideology. So much so that the foundation date of his anti-Japanese guerrilla force, April 25th, became an annual holiday. This guerrilla force was officially transformed into the Korean People's Army, known as KPA, in February 1948. Conscription was in place from the outset, which meant that the KPA has always been a formidable force. Arming such a massive army was a tall order, but the USSR ensured that it was done by pouring weapons, tanks, planes, and artillery into North Korea. With huge numbers and modern equipment, the KPA was one of the most powerful military forces in the post-war world. Meanwhile, the newly formed United Nations tried and failed to settle the Korean Peninsula problem. The USSR opposed free elections and refused to cooperate with the UN, believing that they were puppets controlled by the US. The UN proceeded to hold elections only in the South, and on the 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea, that being South Korea, was born under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only true Korean government. North Korea responded by writing their own constitution. On the 9th of September, they declared themselves as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. North Korea, as we know it today, was finally here. Almost immediately, Kim started planning the reunification of the peninsula. With most American troops withdrawing in June 1949 and the vastly superior northern military at his fingertips, it looked like an easy win. Communism had also seen a string of recent victories that boosted Kim's confidence too. The USSR detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, which ended America's unchallenged nuclear supremacy. In China, Mao's communists overthrew the Republican government and gave him another communist ally. Both Stalin and Mao threw their support behind an invasion, and Mao sent at least 50,000 men from the People's Liberation Army to support him, although Stalin was clear that he would not send in the Red Army. The South expected a war. There were several clashes in 1950 that proved hostility between the two Koreas. Then, on 25th of June 1950, North Korean tanks, planes, and infantry poured over the border in a massive assault. The Northern Army outnumbered the poorly equipped South 2-1, its Air Force by more than 10-1, and North Korea's almost 300 tanks met a grand total of 0 units of South Korean armor. South Korea utterly collapsed. Within 5 days, Kim controlled Seoul. Almost 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or had deserted, and the tiny handful of US troops on the peninsula could do nothing but run in the face of the North's overwhelming advance. As they went, North Korean forces targeted ideological enemies in South Korea. Politicians, anti-communist intellectuals, and business leaders were systematically exterminated by the KPA. Kim Il-sung was beyond pleased. It appeared he'd won a great victory, but that euphoria was short-lived. The United Nations condemned the invasion immediately, and 2 days later, it approved a unified military response to the crisis. Naturally, the US took the lead. Washington was worried that the fall of Korea to communism would threaten Japan and cause a domino effect in the rest of Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd led U.S. forces in the Pacific theater of World War II and currently oversaw U.S. forces in occupied Japan, was given overall command of the UN coalition forces. UN forces landed at Incheon on the 15th of September, 1950. In the largest amphibious assault since World War II, the UN attack shattered the KPA. The North Korean front collapsed, and tens of thousands of KPA soldiers were captured. The UN quickly retook Seoul, and by the end of September, had pushed back to the 38th parallel. By that point, most of North Korea's army had been killed or captured. In October, UN forces pushed into North Korea itself. Kim and his government were forced to flee, and Pyongyang fell to UN forces within weeks. What had looked like a victory was quickly becoming a total defeat. For North Korea, the true story of the war was not on the front lines, but at home. As its armies collapsed, so too did any hope of controlling the air. UN-aligned air forces quickly established dominance in the skies above North Korea and used it to devastating effect. The U.S. Air Force led a colossal bombing campaign that devastated North Korea's population and infrastructure. Entire cities were flattened. Villages were wiped off the map. Pyongyang was so badly bombed that not a single major building was left standing. The U.S. general in charge of the Air Forces said that, by October 1950, the Air Force stopped sending bombers out simply because there was nothing left to bomb. An estimated 80% or more of North Korea's buildings were flattened, as more explosives were dropped on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. Maybe 10% of the North Korean population was killed by the bombing. It is this experience, more than anything else, that shaped North Korean attitudes to the US after the war. Whatever ideological disagreements they might have, and whatever nonsense propaganda the regime puts out, it is the near total leveling of North Korea by US bombing that explains the sheer hatred for the USA that pervades the North Korean state and society. Things improved for North Korea when China stepped in. China had warned the UN forces not to get too close to its territory, and on the 25th of October 1950, they decided that enough was enough. Tens of thousands of Chinese troops burst across the border and surprise attacked the UN forces. The UN was caught unaware and retreated in the face of the sudden attack. Chinese and North Korean forces quickly recaptured Pyongyang, pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, and even retook Seoul for a short period. Kim Il-sung's feelings were mixed. On the one hand, North Korea was back under his control, but the strength of the UN forces made reunification unlikely. Kim resented the loss of so many of his troops and the fact that China was doing most of the fighting. Furthermore, both Stalin and Mao blamed the KPA for being too incompetent to win and causing the war to spiral out of control. UN forces soon regrouped and pushed back. Seoul was retaken in March, its fourth and final conquest in less than a year, and once again it was the communists' turn to retreat north with thousands of their soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The UN reached the 38th parallel again in July 1951, and there, the war would stall for 2 brutal years. From July 1951 to July 1953, the Korean War was a stubborn stalemate that was as grueling and frustrating as the trenches of the First World War. Casualties continued on both sides, but no significant territory changed hands. After several failed attempts to negotiate, both sides finally came to an agreement on the 27th of July, 1953. It was not a peace treaty, but an armistice. Both sides agreed to halt military operations, release prisoners, and return the remains of the deceased. The armistice set up an internationally monitored demilitarized zone, the Korean DMZ, along the border to mark the boundary between the two nations. The war has been left unfinished ever since. Skirmishes and episodes of violence have broken out, but for the most part, North and South Korea have been locked in a tense standoff that has threatened to spill over into a devastating war at any moment for the last 70 years. North Korea emerged from the war a broken and battered nation. Its army was almost destroyed. Its cities were in ruins. Its population was exhausted and demoralized. Kim Il-sung and his regime now faced the monumental task of rebuilding their country and navigating the perilous Cold War world. It was a task that required a fresh start, a rebirth of North Korea for a brand new age. The war devastated North Korea socially and economically. Overall economic output fell by 75% from 1949 to 1953. Output of energy, fuel, chemicals, metallurgy, and agriculture was a fraction of what it had been before the war. North Korea needed a rebirth, and Kim Il-sung set out the ways in which they'd achieve it. In 1953, he clarified 4 goals that would guide the nation in the coming years. First, he would consolidate what he called the People's Democratic System. In simpler terms, this meant doubling down on communist ideology and ramping up the propaganda to ensure that everyone was a loyal citizen. Second was to rebuild the economy and improve people's living standards. With much of the country in ruins, this was an obvious goal, but it would be a monumental task. Still, with total control over the economy and the support of their foreign allies, Pyongyang was confident it could be achieved. Third was to improve national defense. The army had to be rebuilt, the border had to be properly fortified, and they needed to secure modern equipment to stay competitive in a changing world. Last but not least, the unending goal of reunification remained. Kim's hopes had been shattered during the war, but he and other North Koreans remained convinced that it was possible. North Korea had its work cut out for it. One of Kim's first priorities was repairing the damage his ideology took from the war. The North Korean Workers' Party had lost many members during the conflict, so he funded massive re-education programs to bolster the party's ranks and reaffirm their ideology, ensuring the party's long-term survival. However, the more serious damage was to the North Korean Worker Party's prestige. The Communists had presided over a failed war that had not reunified the country as promised, and communism itself had been rejected by the South Korean masses, who failed to rise up to support their northern invaders. Kim decided to redirect blame for those failures towards his internal rivals. By scapegoating his enemies, Kim redirected popular resentment away from himself and towards the rival communist factions. By removing these people from power, he crippled his internal enemies and could fill government positions with his own allies instead. It was transparent and predictable, but it was awfully effective. The Soviet Korean communist leader Ho Kai-I faced Kim's wrath towards the war's end, when he was purged of his posts and blamed for a series of failures in the country's response to the war, especially the slow repairs of dams and infrastructure bombed by the Americans. The accusations drove Ho Kai-I to suicide, or so the regime claimed. Another victim was Kim's old rival Park Han-young. The leader of the South Korean Communist faction had been appointed foreign minister and had promised Kim that the Southerners would rise up and join the North when their communist forces rolled in. This obviously did not happen. Kim dismissed him from his post in 1953 and then had him arrested on accusations of being an American spy. Only disloyalty, the regime argued, could explain such a complete failure. He was given a show trial and executed in December 1955. Hundreds of communist figures found themselves fired, imprisoned, or executed in the months after the war in a similar fashion, and Kim's grip on power became ever tighter. With Kim's power almost unchallenged, it fell to him to decide how North Korea would proceed. He formulated an ideology that would guide his country into the future, an ideology called Juche. Juche was and remains the guiding principle of the entire country. Its elements were first expressed in a 1955 speech by Kim Il-sung, and it essentially means self-reliance. North Korea strives to be militarily, socially, and economically capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Cooperation with fellow socialist states was welcome, but dependence undermined the country's power. Economically, this meant a rejection of international trade as the path to prosperity, and a focus on self-sufficiency. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea would strive to grow all of its own food, develop all of its own technology, and extract all of its own raw materials. Socially, it meant a thorough education in Juche ideology for all citizens, and an insulation from outside ideas that might compromise the ideological unity of the nation. All of this, of course, was in a Marxist-Leninist framework, but Kim stressed that Korean thought and experiences should determine how those Marxist-Leninist ideas would be applied in practice. Juche also defined the North against the South. For Kim, the North was a fiercely independent nation that stood on its own, while the South was an American puppet shackled to its trading partners and military alliances. However, Juche is more than a practical philosophy. It's also an intense love of North Korea. One historian of North Korea described Juche as an assumption that Korea is at the center of the world. All citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea must passionately love their country, and by extension, its leader. Understanding Juche is the key to understanding modern North Korea. North Korea had a goal and a means of attaining it, but it also needed a center to anchor the whole system, and Kim made himself that center. The 20th century was already no stranger to dictators whose personality cults consumed their nations, but Kim Il-sung's cult would put all of them to shame. The level of worship Kim and his descendants receive in North Korea to this day is one of the most striking and disturbing aspects of the regime. At first, Kim was following in the footsteps of his contemporaries like Mao and Stalin. In 1953, he declared himself Sir-Yong, or Great Leader, and became a sort of embodiment of the nation. However, that amount of power and prestige could make anyone unhinged. Furthermore, by becoming the representative of the nation, any attack on Kim became an attack on North Korea. And in a country that emphasized loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the dictators was an inevitable consequence. This cult quickly grew out of control. It became illegal to write over a photo of Kim Il-sung, or to wrap things in newspapers that mentioned his name. It was even an offense to print his photo on poor quality paper. However, the ruler cult almost brought Kim down before he really began. After the death of Stalin, the USSR took a hard pivot against leader cults. In February 1956, the new Soviet leader Khrushchev openly denounced Stalin and his personality cult, along with any other leaders who tried to emulate it. Still dependent on Soviet aid and support, Kim was forced to obey when Khrushchev summoned him to Moscow to be privately scalded for his own ruler cult in the summer of that year. In his absence, Soviet and Yunnan communist factions hatched a conspiracy. They shared Khrushchev's disgust with the ruler cult and called Sung out for his arbitrary punishment of dissenters. They also criticized his regime's economic policies and his bias towards his own guerrilla faction of communists. When Kim returned for the annual party meeting in late August, he was met with condemnation by the leaders of the other factions. Pak Chong-ok, leader of the Soviet faction, and Cho Chang-i, leader of the Yunnan faction, along with several of their allies, took to the stage at the party conference and tore into Kim as a tyrant and egomaniac whose actions were undermining socialist principles. But Kim's enemies had miscalculated. The Soviet and Yunnan factions were too anchored in the USSR and China for their support. Meanwhile, Kim was a nationalist hero, a true Korean who had fought the guerrilla fight to free his nation. For many, Kim represented juche, self-reliance, while his enemies would submit North Korea to the powers of foreign nations. At the party conference, Kim's critics were shouted down. They overestimated their support, and the party voted to expel Cho Chang-il and Park Chung-ho. Over the following months, dozens of leaders from both factions disappeared as Kim purged everyone he could lay his hands on. It is unknown how many people died, but it was so bad that Beijing and Moscow sent a joint delegation pleading with Kim to stop the purges. Kim simply ignored them. Most just disappeared. They were forgotten in hard labor camps, or shot and buried in an unmarked grave. About 11 people were convicted in show trials and executed as enemies of the state. By 1960, Park and Cho were dead. The Soviet and Yunnan factions had been completely destroyed, and there was no one left in North Korea who would dare challenge Kim Il-sung's power. Politics dealt with, Kim turned towards economic issues. In August 1953, he set out his vision for a 3-year plan to run from 1954 to 1956. Kim laid out investment plans to boost the nation's economy. Heavy industry was the main priority, with over 80% of all industrial investment going to sectors such as mining and construction. The plan also set out extensive quotas for every industry and directed workers to devote themselves to laboring for the state. According to Pyongyang, it was a success. Industrial and agricultural production had returned to their pre-war levels by early 1957. However, external observers noted that the numbers were probably skewed. Thanks to all of that investment, heavy industry had probably improved beyond pre-war levels, but vital industries like agriculture and fishing had not. In reality, the focus on quotas and output had devastating consequences. Like China during the Great Famine, the regime exacerbated its own problems with its focus on quotas and numbers. Regional officials who failed to meet agricultural quotas were punished, so officials were incentivized to lie. This continued at each level, lie piling upon lie, leaving Pyongyang with a completely warped view of the country's actual state. This was especially bad for farmers who would have food seized by the state based on exaggerated reports of food output, which produced a famine in 1955 that killed thousands of people. This disaster was hidden from the non-communist world, but Pyongyang's allies in Beijing and Moscow were deeply concerned. The truth about the famine could harm communism's image abroad. Both countries sent food aid, but not enough to make up for the deficit. The regime worked hard to bury all evidence of this famine, and it was only in the 2000s when historians began combing through the Soviet archives that its existence was rediscovered. Data is incomplete, but an estimated 800,000 people died between 1954 and 1955. The East German government at the time believed that as many as 25% of North Korea's children had starved to death. Declaring the plan a success, Kim followed it up with a 5-year plan from 1957 to 1961. While the former was for reconstruction, this new plan focused on developing in a new direction and bringing North Korea into modernity. The first plan had been great for industry, but the common people still lacked food, housing, and clothing. Pyongyang was still too obsessed with heavy industry quotas over agricultural output. Both China and the USSR criticized Kim's plan and urged him to change it, but Kim stayed his course. The Chalama Ondong, or Flying Horses campaign, was Kim's way of ramping up production. It was a massive propaganda campaign to encourage productivity and gave out rewards such as medals for factories and workers who exceeded their monthly quotas. Workers could also be organized into teams and compete with other teams for maximum output. They may be communists, but even North Korea realized that competition could be good for the economy. The press was filled with these Cholima riders, whose hard work was held up as a symbol of true patriotism. Kim also took to visiting production sites to encourage and inspire the workers, which became huge propaganda features for the regime. Another key part of Kim's motivation campaign were on-the-spot guidance visits, where Kim himself would visit farms, factories, or other facilities to motivate workers. According to the propaganda, he would use his immense wisdom to instruct the workers how to be better at their jobs and achieve their quotas. On-the-spot guidance has become one of the most iconic parts of regime propaganda and has been kept up by all of Kim Il-sung's successors. Their motivation campaigns were combined with nationalization and reorganization that tightened state and party control of the economy. By 1958, North Korea had collectivized every farm, and by the following year, it had reached full nationalization of all industry and trade. The obsession with quotas and productivity also had its dark sides. The pressure to exceed and expand led to punishment and social consequences for workers or teams who fell behind. The government even started a drink no soup campaign, encouraging workers to not eat or drink as much, so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom during work hours. So, was it all a success? It's not so simple. The more Kim pushed, the more the workers were exhausted. The quality of work started to decline, even as the quantity increased. Kim complained that companies were being lazy and would rush to meet their monthly quotas with shoddy workmanship of goods and materials. And by the late 1950s and early 1960s, production growth had stalled again. In theory, by 1959, North Korea had met its production quotas, and the government declared the plan completed ahead of schedule. The big picture numbers definitely looked great. The North's per capita GDP was $140, well above the South's $81, and many industries had seen increases in production by 50% or more. However, the GDP was inflated by industrial output at the expense of the food, clothing, and housing that Kim claimed to prioritize. The average North Korean remained wretchedly poor, living in temporary shanty towns, and many of them suffered from malnutrition. Industrial development came before the well-being of the people. The state also altered the numbers to not count industries such as coal, steel, copper, and fertilizer, which had all failed to meet their planned targets. Grain output was also curiously absent from the official 1959 statistics. It's telling that the government immediately planned a year of adjustment in 1960 to try and rebalance the numbers in preparation for a new phase of economic planning into the 1960s. And never again would North Korea publish thorough data about its economic situation.